My name's Mamie. I got an A star in my A Level History. In today's History Explained video, we're going to be looking at the government of Henry VII. This features in part 1 of the AQA Tudor History paper. In this video, we're going to start off by looking at the specification this part of the topic covers, before moving on to previous questions and potential questions that could come up, before finally looking at content. And with this, we'll look at Henry VII's government, councils, parliament, justice, royal finance, and domestic policies. The notes on your screen are part of a revision notes pack that you can find on our website, historyexplained.co.uk, that cover the entirety of this course period, from Henry VII to Elizabeth I. Also on our website, you can find many more resources, including essay plans and essay writing courses, as well as finding resources for tutoring and live webinars. Okay, so let's start having a look. So Henry VII's government is the second part of the first section of the Tudor A-level course. So we're looking at part 1, Consolidation of the Tudor Dynasty, England 1485 to 1547. So in the previous video, we were looking at the background Henry VII's power, and in this video, we're going to be looking at how he implements it. So let's have a quick scan of some past paper questions. Here we have examples like Henry VII's royal authority was never secure. Henry VII had successfully established his monarchical authority by 1509. Feel free to pause and have a look at the rest of the questions. One thing you'll notice about the wording of the question is that the phrasing establishing of authority is pretty key. So this is a reflection of basically what this first part of the course is about. It's about the establishment of the Tudor dynasty. How did Henry VII take a country that had been torn apart by civil war and create a dynasty that would go on to last 100 years? So here we've included some potential essay questions that you can have a go at using as a revision resource to put together some plans, or to even write them as timed essay answers. Okay, so let's move on to content. So as I said, in the last section, you will have looked at the background of Henry VII and looked at how he came to power in the wake of the War of the Roses. So here we have a bit of a look at kind of what level of authority Henry VII came into in England. So the power structure in England at the time had the monarch at the very, very top. Beneath that we have nobility, then we have farmers, then we have the working classes, kind of the majority of people, and beneath that we have the peasant class. So as you might have heard, we have this phrase, the divine right of kings. So the idea is that the monarch has been ordained by God and is God's representative on earth, and this is very much a feature of this period. So Henry VII's power at the top is very, very key and relatively omnipotent. However, it's very much worth looking at this second rung in the ladder, and this is the nobility. So in 1485, there were some really key families. These were the Stanleys and the Percys, amongst others. But they had serious territorial power, wealth, as well as private armies, and this could rival the crown's influence and power. So for Henry VII, particularly as a kind of in a relatively unstable position in 1485, maintaining peace and cooperation nobility was absolutely essential. This is not only to maintain law and order, because the nobility kind of were in charge of all the people on the lower rungs of this pyramid in their given region and in their territory, but also, you know, they've got a lot of influence and power and money. So trying to balance this relationship with them is also really important, kind of politically. So if we move down, we've got some examples of some key nobles that you might want to memorize for your exam. So here we've given 6. It's not essential that you know every single one of these names for your exam, but it's worth picking out a couple that you can kind of name drop in your essays. So let's have a look at them now. Here, first of all, we've got John de Vere, who's the 13th Earl of Oxford, 1485. He was a Lancastrian in the War of the Roses, and he was a serious supporter of the Tudors and Henry VII's most trusted ally. So he's an important person in Henry VII's court. Next on Henry VII's side as an important noble is Jasper Tudor, Duke of Bedford. He is Henry VII's uncle and another great supporter. So here we've got kind of two key people who are supporters of nobles who are supporters of Henry VII, which is important for his hold of power in Parliament. Next going down, we've got Thomas Stanley of the important Stanley family. So he's actually the stepfather of Henry VII. He's married to Henry VII's mother. He's also a Lancastrian, and he is an ally. However, here we're kind of thinking about like the balance of power politically. So although he's on Henry VII's side and also has a personal investment because he's basically a family member, he's also very powerful, has a lot of money, and has a private army. So he's somebody that not only Henry VII wants to keep on side because of the risk element, but also has to kind of manage as a potential threat to his own power. Okay, so moving on, we've got an example of a couple of nobles who had supported the Yorks in the War of the Roses. So here we've got Henry Percy of the important Percy family and Thomas Howard, a name that will come up later on again. And these men both fought for Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth. And looking at a comparison of the two, we can see the ways in which Henry VII kind of wielded and quite cleverly used his political power. So in the case of Henry Percy, he was actually pardoned by Henry VII in 1485. So this is an example of Henry VII being quite clever in how he allows people to have power. So he allows Henry Percy to retain a lot of his power, a lot of his wealth, even though he was a Yorkist, because he consented and recognised Henry VII as king. A slightly different example is Thomas Howard, who was initially stripped of his titles and his funds by Henry VII. But once he proved his loyalty in 1485, these powers and titles were restored. And the final example is John Morton, Archbishop of Canterbury, and this is important because the clergy were also members of the nobility, and having religious allies was really important. So he's really a minor noble, but he was a strong supporter of Henry VII while he was in exile. So before Henry VII is king, John Morton is a relatively minor player, but once Henry VII becomes the king, he is kind of elevated to the status of Archbishop, which is the highest level of the church you can be in England at the time. So this is kind of showing the way that Henry VII kind of elevates his allies, but also elevates his enemies, kind of like keeping them close so you can watch them. Okay, so now we've got a bit of a picture of what Henry VII's government looked like. Let's move on to finance. So here we've just got a few key terms. Some of them you may know already, particularly if you do economics. Some of them you might not, so feel free to have a little pause and read through. So let's move on to have a look at the Crown's financial position in 1485. So obviously after 3 decades of civil war, the finances were very weak. A lot of money had gone into funding the war on each side. And the Tudor family wasn't exactly necessarily the most rich. So upon Henry VII's ascension, he was very reliant on individuals and institutions external to the monarchy to lay the foundation. So this is him again having to rely on the rich and powerful nobility to kind of provide those initial funds that just weren't there in the monarch's budget. Okay, so with this in mind, this leads us to kind of one of the key features of Henry VII's reign, and this is the idea of financial solvency of the crown. So one of the key goals and aims of Henry VII as king was to create a crown and a monarchy that was financially independent of any kind of other power, that had enough money to not need to be reliant on anyone or anything. So the way that he went about doing this is drawing a clear distinction between the financial obligations of the court and the financial obligations of the country. So let's have a look at the financial obligations of the court. So the court's finances are basically all the expenditure of the royal administration and the household. This is specifically kind of the funds and the spending of the monarchy. So Henry VII decides that under him, this is all going to be controlled and supervised in one place under the chamber, and he is going to have oversight on absolutely everything relating to funding of the court. He kind of takes it out of any kind of broader idea of funding, and this is specifically his own focus. And in doing so, he separates it from this other area, which is the financial obligations of the country. So the financial obligations of the country is anything relating to justice, defence, parliamentary taxation. And Henry VII moves this and separates it out from the financial obligations of the court and says that all these kind of finances that are affecting day-to-day people are to be funded by the nobility, local gentry, and taxpayers. So the crown is no longer financially responsible for any of these things. So this ensured that there was a distinct economic separation between the nobility and the monarchy, but also avoided resentment building among a nobility that had otherwise been responsible for the court spending and had weakened earlier kings. So the idea is it's kind of almost win-win for everybody, but most win for Henry VII. So he's now, the crown is responsible for the crown's own finances, and the nobility is basically responsible for everything else. But before he was king, the nobility was kind of responsible for everything else and some of the crown's finances. So by doing this, he kind of allows more freedom for the crown without putting too much of a burden on the nobility. So let's move on and have a look at what these reforms actually look like, the timeline of them, and kind of how they were implemented. So here we've got a timeline. Okay, so looking at this timeline, let's start off by thinking about the aims of Henry VII's government and financial reforms. So he had 3 clear goals, and this was 1, to centralise power. So thinking about things like the chamber, he wants the power of the crown to be with the crown. He doesn't want to be reliant on nobility. He doesn't want nobility to be able to interfere. This is specifically for the monarch and the monarch alone. Then he wants to control the nobility. So if we're thinking back up to the previous section of the notes, and we're thinking about people like Thomas Stanley and Henry Percy, these are all very powerful people that have the ability to kind of make or break the king's rule, right? So they can, if he has them on side and is able to control them, then he, you know, maintains his power. But if he slips up, then they have enough manpower and money that they can really threaten the crown. Okay, and the final aim is something we talked about earlier, and this is the achievement of financial solvency. So this is basically the ability for the crown to be financially independent. So here we have a timeline, kind of symbolized down into government reforms, financial reforms, and then obviously there are some that are both governmental and financial. Okay, so let's just have a look at the key points in this timeline. So this is something that we've spoken about earlier. This is the establishment of the chamber system, which comes in early at 1485, as soon as Henry VII takes the throne. So this is Henry VII restoring order to royal accounts and shifting control of revenue from the exchequer to the more flexible chamber system. So this is kind of moving the control of royal accounts and revenue from the power of the parliament to specifically, exclusively, the power of the monarch. As we go down, we have a look at examples of the way that Henry VII bolstered the financial solvency of the crown. So we look at the Act of Resumption. This is recovering all the crown's land lost since 1455. So any land of the crown that kind of been lost during battles in the Wars of the Roses or kind of given as concession, that is all taken back into the power of the crown. So Henry VII is expanding the land and the money that comes with the land back into the pocket of the monarch. Then we've got an important thing, which is the development of the council learned in law. So this is a mechanism that acted as a royal debt collector, enforcing feudal dues and securing the king's financial rights. So with this, the king is setting up a new council that is picked, every man in the council is picked by him and is supervised by him. And with this, he's kind of able to shake up the political dynamics in the court. So whereas the most powerful families like the Percys and the Stanleys and the Howards might have automatically had more power because they had more money, with the council learned in law, Henry VII is able to promote men like John Morton, who are previously relatively minor politically, and put them in a position over financial control of the country. Okay, next as we go down a little bit more, we've got creation of the Privy Chamber. This restricted access to the king, separating personal and political spheres and strengthening royal control over patronage. So here we have the king previously was kind of just like open access to the court. But now if you want to have like a kind of political one-on-one with the king, you have to kind of go through the privy chamber. You can't just make requests. It has to be, there's kind of a real structure and bureaucracy put in place. Next, between 1497 and 1500, we've got the streamlining of local government with the creation of justices of the peace. So justices of the peace are really interesting because this is a real move in the way that power is structured broadly in England in local areas. So this is the local officials appointed annually to maintain law and order, limiting power of the nobility. So previously, a lot of the power of the nobility went completely unchecked. So in their own areas, like if they had like land in, you know, northern England, the nobility there who owned that land basically had kind of say over everything that happened. So if they were a nice noble, life could be quite good. If they were less nice, life might be a bit more tough. But here there's a kind of a check on the power of nobility. So you have the stage below nobility, and they are given these roles, elected roles basically, that allow them to check the power of nobility above them and the power of those below them. So it means that the nobility can't just get away with whatever they want. They have to kind of go through this more bureaucratic system. So yeah, here we've got examples of the ways in which Henry VII used his governmental and financial reforms to centralise power, control the nobility, and achieve financial solvency. So moving on, here we have a debate which is okay, so moving on. A big debate in this period is the question of, was Henry VII a miser king? Now, this is a kind of historiographical debate. It's something that's kind of very much came up contemporarily, but has much been discussed subsequently. Now, the phrase miser king is a ruler who's obsessed with money and reluctant to spend it. So Henry VII garnered this reputation as a miser king from his cautious financial policies and his determination to restore royal solvency in the wake of civil war. So his extremely strict control of revenue, his reforms and discipline of the nobility, and his exploitation of feudal dues and legal fines created an image of a monarch who valued wealth over generosity. So here we have this kind of image of a king who was like obsessed with money and would kind of at any cost take any chances, no matter how exploitative they were, of either the nobility or just kind of the general classes of society to grow the wealth of the crown. Now, contemporary observers at the time did criticise his greed, especially under the harsh enforcement of Epsom and Dudley in his final years, which we'll be looking at in a later section. However, modern historians argue that Henry VII's frugality was not simple miserliness or representative of some kind of selfish money-grabbing persona, but a deliberate strategy to secure financial independence of the crown and ensure a lasting stability of the Tudor dynasty. So something that's quite key to Henry VII very early on is his vision of a kind of line of successive Tudor rulers. And in order to do this, financial solvency of the crown was necessary and arguably successful. Like, there's 100 years of Tudor rule, and a lot of that came from the way that Henry VII stabilised the crown and stabilised the monarchy through the financial solvency that he was able to establish. And beyond this, if we look at Henry VII in context of the time, he did establish an annual income of £113,000 by 1509. At the same time, the French King Louis maintained an annual income of 800,000, which is considerably more. So although Henry VII may have achieved the highest income for an English monarch in a century, it was still only a fraction of his contemporary European rulers. Henry VII as a miser king is quite a useful focal point for your revision. It's unlikely that you'll get a question asking you, was Henry VII a miser king? But if you do, now you know what it is. But what it does, it gives you an opportunity to really push your AO3 essay skills, so kind of really evaluating. So you've got these two sides of the argument. Yes, he was a miser king because, you know, he did take a lot of money, he did consume a lot of money, and he did really grow the wealth of the crown. but at the same time, was it that crazy compared to other leaders? And also, was it or was it not successful? Did it achieve his goal of securing a Tudor dynasty? And was that really at the root of it rather than actual interest in the finance? Okay, so moving on. Here we've got a table of the effectiveness of Henry VII's government and financial reforms. So, as examples of the effectiveness, we think about the core aims we were looking at earlier on: centralisation of power, financial solvency, control and nobility. He did all three. He established firm control through smaller established councils and close supervision of finance by the chamber, and effectively centralised power. By 1509, the crown was solvent, with an annual income of £113,000 and the strongest royal finances in a century. He achieved financial solvency. And finally, control and nobility. Using bonds and restrictions on retaining, curbed the threat of nobility and ended the threat of private armies. Okay, so now let's look at limitations and weaknesses. So, while power was centralised and the nobility were brought under control, this over-centralisation, you could argue, did create resentment, particularly among the nobility. Next, if we look at financial reform, although solvency was achieved, it was deeply unpopular. Harsh collection of dues and exploitation of bonds, particularly by Epsom Dudley, damaged the crown's reputation and led to this kind of characterisation of Henry VII as the miser king. And finally, one of the key weaknesses that would prove to be lasting for the Tudors was the reliance on the king's personal control. So the system depended heavily on Henry VII's meticulous attention. For example, the chamber replacing the exchequer as a main financial office. So Henry VII's kind of personal supervision of everything meant that for everything to work, it relied on him. And, you know, he died in 1509. He wasn't going to continue that on. So the power structures he put in place relied on the kind of king that he was. And the kind of king that he was really wasn't going to feature again until the reign of Elizabeth I. So, here at the bottom, finally, we have some historical interpretations. The AQA exam doesn't require you to reference historians, so although we've included some looking at Stephen Gunn, Thomas Penn, and R.L. Story, there's no pressure to memorize these names, but it's really useful to think about the way that you can use historians to understand the period better and to look at history through a historiographical lens. So, you know, the facts generally are the facts. The resources we have about history are generally the resources we have about history, but it's about how we interpret and understand them. So here you'll see examples of three historians who have taken a lot of the same evidence, but really understood it in different ways. Okay, so let's have a quick look back at the past paper questions we looked at the beginning of the video. So we've got a question like, Henry VII had successfully established his monarchical authority by 1509. Now, for a question like this, you might want to be looking at other topics. You might want to bring in elements such as foreign policy. You might want to be looking at society. However, specifically looking at the topics of government and economy, you could suggest that, yeah, he did successfully establish monarchical authority by 1509. His core three goals of centralising power, achieving financial solvency, and controlling the nobility were all achieved, in which case the monarchy that Henry VII wanted to create was in fact created. So using these notes, you can put together an essay plan specific for a question along those lines. Okay, and in our next video, we'll be looking at the relationships with Scotland and other foreign powers under Henry VII. If you enjoyed these notes, you're able to purchase them online at historyexplained.co.uk, along with many other resources, including essay plans and our free essay writing course. We have resources for your other A-level subjects too, including geography, sociology, and politics under our umbrella of Humanities Explained. So feel free to have a look at our YouTube channels for those and our websites, where we also sell resources including revision notes, webinars, essay plans, exam writing courses, and offer tutoring if that's something you're interested in as well. Thank you very much for watching.